If you were to tell me you don't know who CMF is, I wouldn't blame you, because they were established in 2023, they brought out their first smartphone, the Phone 1, in 2024, and they're also a sub-brand of Nothing, the relatively new kid on the block, at least when it comes to the smartphone industry. So today we're looking at the CMF Phone 2 Pro, which on paper looks actually pretty promising, not only in comparison to its predecessor, but also some of its competitors. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found in two different configurations: 8GB of RAM with 128GB of storage, and 8GB of RAM with 256GB of storage. Now, the former can be found for £219 and €249, while the latter can be found for £249 and €279, and also is available in the US via the beta program for $279. So we're in this review going to see if it's actually worth its price tag, and of course how it compares to some of its key competitors. So to kick things off, I would just like to point out that within the box you've got the smartphone with a pre-applied screen protector, a USB Type-C to Type-C cable for charging or indeed data transfer, and a SIM tray ejector tool. Furthermore, you've also got a protective case, which has also got a see-through design, which I certainly appreciate. This allows you to have a bit more of a flush design in terms of its back, because due to the rear camera configuration, without a case, it does actually wobble. Now, this actually does bring me onto its overall aesthetics. And here it has got a thickness of just 7.8mm. It's in fact the slimmest of the Nothing lineup. It also weighs in at just 185 grams, therefore making it very easy for one-handed operation. There is also a few different color finishes for you to choose from, with white, orange, black, and the pictured light green. The latter two have got a glass-like back and therefore have got a frosted look, although make no mistake, it still has got a plastic enclosure with a metallic frame. Personally, I actually quite like the orange finish because it's got a metallic sheen color instead, and therefore really makes it stand out over some rival alternatives. Now, all the phones, no matter which sort of color you go for, have got IP54 dust and water resistance, therefore giving you an upgrade over the older generation model and very much in line with some of its modern competitors. Now, its rear design is certainly quirky, and that sort of industrial feel with the bolts are actually done on purpose, because here you can actually fit a universal cover, allowing you to have certain accessories snapped onto it. Now, in comparison to the older generation Phone 1, which didn't require a universal cover, this does mean that you are going to be adding to the overall thickness of the smartphone, which in my opinion does feel a little bit counterintuitive. Nonetheless, this sort of modular feel to it, allowing you to place, for example, lenses, a wallet, a stand, or even a lanyard, is really nice thinking by the manufacturer. Something a little bit outside of the box, and therefore gives you the ability to customize it to a certain degree. I quite like this, although I suspect a lot of consumers probably won't actually opt for it because it does seem a little bit redundant given the overall accessories that you can buy via third-party suppliers instead. Now, as we flip over the phone, you'll find an under-display optical fingerprint sensor, which is actually really snappy. I had no problems whatsoever doing my tests. Furthermore, you can pair this up with Face Unlock, although it's worth bearing in mind over here that you do not have 3D biometric data, and as a result it's not as secure as using your fingerprint, a pattern, or indeed a password. Now, this does actually bring me on to talking about the 6.77-inch 120Hz AMOLED display, which has got support for HDR10+ and has got a resolution of 1080 by 2392. The display itself is actually very vivid and has got fantastic colors. Furthermore, it does get pretty bright, with it tested at 740 nits in the maximum auto modes. In other words, in bright sunlight conditions, you won't have any sort of problems while looking at the display. It does also get pretty dim. Without the max dim mode enabled, I noticed a minimum brightness of 2.29 nits. This means that you can use it in a pretty dark scenario without actually troubling your eyes. And just to further emphasize the point, you've got 2160Hz PWM dimming, which further emphasizes that this phone can be used in very low light scenarios and at night without giving you any sort of eye strain or any sort of headaches. Elsewhere, I would like to point out that it's protected by Panda Glass, which will give you some extra peace of mind. And as I did mention before, you have got that pre-applied screen protector as well. Now, while its display is pretty impressive, specifically given its overall price point, what really stands out for me more than anything is its rear camera configuration. First off, you've got a 50 megapixel f1.88 wide lens, and it's actually got a larger sensor over the previous generation model. Then you've got a 50 megapixel f1.85 telephoto with 2x optical zoom and 20x digital zoom. And to round it off, you've got an 8 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide. Now the latter doesn't exactly do all that well. Given the lower megapixel count, it does mean that the image will look a little bit more blurry and less sharp in comparison to the main lens. Nonetheless, its inclusion is certainly appreciated because it can be handy in certain scenarios. But the main camera lens, in my opinion, is really where it stands out. The overall color reproduction is really impressive, the overall skin tones look pretty accurate, and the amount of detail it's actually able to draw in, not only just due to its aperture, but also due to the overall megapixel count, is certainly very impressive. It is worth highlighting here that you have got a 50 megapixel and 12 megapixel mode that you can select via the camera app. Now here, I will also like to highlight that in terms of the overall autofocus, it's done via phase detection. However, I did find it to be a little bit poor. See, while taking certain shots, they were sometimes all blurry. And this was actually just due to that I hadn't actually tapped to take a photo, or indeed the fact that the phone hadn't recognized the actual subject that I was actually looking at. I noticed this not only in still photography, but also in low light conditions. Speaking of which, its overall low light performance is a little bit lackluster, specifically when it comes to zooming in. It's no surprise given its overall limitations and the overall price point that the manufacturer is asking for, but it's just something I thought I should highlight in this review. In other words, don't expect the utmost best photo quality in low light conditions, but in normal lighting conditions, I think you'll be left pretty impressed. Now the same could be said about its overall selfie camera, because here you've got a 16 megapixel f2.45 wide lens, and the overall results actually speak for themselves. In normal lighting conditions, it actually does do a really good job, specifically given if you have got the portrait mode enabled. It blurs the background very well, and in this respect does compete with far more expensive alternatives. Yet again, when it comes to low light photography, it does struggle. And in this respect, you can actually help it by enabling the likes of the flash mode, which will effectively light up your screen in white before taking the photo. It'll take a few extra seconds, so just worth bearing that in mind. Ultimately over here, in comparison to some of its nearest competitors, it does go toe-to-toe with them, specifically when it comes to its front camera configuration. However, as I did highlight, when it comes to its rear camera configuration, in my opinion, it actually does do a better job. Another thing that left me actually quite impressed is its recording capabilities, because you can shoot at 4K 30fps and 1080p at 30 and 60fps. There's also a dedicated slow-mo mode, which allow you to shoot 1080p at 120fps. As for its zooming capabilities while recording, it can go up to 6 times. You might actually want to use it sparingly because you'll be able to notice quite a lot of jitter and noise that appears as you zoom in. Nonetheless, at a standstill, the video capabilities are actually pretty good. Although do bear in mind what I did mention when it comes to still photography, in other words, the phase detection autofocus is actually relatively poor, and hopefully the manufacturer can actually address this via future firmware iterations. Although I will actually be surprised if they can actually really improve the overall autofocus over the air. Nonetheless, just something worth highlighting if you're going to be shooting a video. Make sure the actual subject is actually in focus. Aside from this, if you're going to be moving around, there is no OIS, in other words, optical image stabilization with any of the lenses. And as a result, you're actually left with AI stabilization instead, which the manufacturer claims is actually quite impressive. However, from my own tests, I did find that there is quite a bit of jitter as you're moving around. This, I suspect, won't be too much of an issue for a lot of individuals because you're not going to be running with a smartphone, but just, again, worth highlighting that if you're going to be moving around with a smartphone, just bear in mind that it's not going to be as good as some other smartphones that have OIS instead. Now, as for the selfie recording capabilities, it can shoot at 1080p, 30 and 60 FPS, which is very much appreciated. Although it's worth noting that when it comes to low light recording capabilities, it does struggle. Thankfully, however, you have got a dedicated night mode, which will shoot at 1080p 30fps. It's a shame over here it's not available at 60fps, because the overall light that is able to draw in within night mode is far more impressive, and therefore is something that I'll actually utilize if it comes to recording myself with the selfie camera. Another very important factor for a lot of consumers is the amount of runtime, and by that I mean you have got a 5000 mAh battery pack to power you through your day. From my controlled benchmarks, I netted a very impressive 27 hours. As you'll be able to see over here, not only does it do well in comparison to more expensive alternatives, and yes, including some of the ones from Nothing themselves, but it also does far better than some of its key competitors. For example, the Poco M7 Pro, which I recently tested, or the more budget-friendly Moto G35. Indeed, the CMF actually does do pretty good, and in this respect will last you 1.5 to 2 days of light to medium usage. If you're a heavy user, then expect roughly 1 day. Now here you have also got 33 watt of wired charging capabilities via its USB Type-C ports. And you've also got 5 watt of reverse wired charging capabilities as well, making it quite handy for supported devices. It is worth highlighting, however, that due to its design, it does not have any sort of reverse wireless charging capabilities, nor wireless charging capabilities at all. Next up we get onto performance, and housed within is the Mediatek Dimensity 7300 Pro 5G chipset, with an octa-core CPU and a Mali G615 MC2 GPU. You've got 8GB of RAM, but you've also got an additional 8GB of RAM booster capabilities, therefore taking you up to a theoretical 16GB. Of course, this will utilize some of your storage. Now in Geekbench 6, I noticed a single core score of 1012 and a multi-core score of 2936. As you will see from the graph, it's not exactly the best, nor is it the worst in its class. Now I would just like to point out that I was not able to run GFX Bench, which is a graphical benchmark which I normally run on my smartphone reviews, allowing me to compare and contrast them. I suspect this was because it was blocked by the manufacturer. Nonetheless, when it came to gaming, I felt that the overall experience was relatively fluid. Although in certain instances I did find that the FPS was dropping, and therefore meant it felt a little bit more stuttery. It's no surprise over here given the overall chipset that's been paired with it, and in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, well, they give you a near-like experience. So it's nothing really to be overly complaining about given the overall price point of the Phone 2 Pro. However, where it does stand out is when it comes to its overall software optimization. Because here you've got Nothing OS 3.2 that's built upon Android 15. You're promised only 3 years worth of upgrades and 6 years worth of security upgrades. This is actually a little bit disappointing in comparison to some of its competitors, but I suspect over here will certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers. The software itself is actually very fluid. It's also really refreshing not to see that much bloatware. In fact, there's pretty much none of it, which is something of a rarity in comparison to its modern competitors, which often ship with a lot of extra apps that you're not going to ever need. Of course, you can usually uninstall or disable them, but still when it comes to the initial experience that Nothing or indeed CMF are trying to provide you, well, it's certainly very positive. Of course, you've got certain personalization and customization that's still available, therefore allowing you to tailor the phone to your own needs. With that said, I did notice a bug, and funny enough was the exact same problem that I noticed while reviewing the Nothing Phone 3A and the 3A Pro. See, if you have auto rotate enabled and you have the phone flat on a surface, for example a table, you'll find that in certain apps, for example the gallery app, the camera app, or indeed for example a browser, it will automatically open in the landscape format, which is incorrect. See here, the phone is not smart enough to realize that it's actually on a flat surface and you've been using the phone in a portrait format. It's not something that I've noticed on any of its competitors, so it's just something I thought I should highlight. Hopefully Nothing and indeed CMF can address this via future firmware updates, because it should be relatively easy to fix. Now aside from this, you have also got the essential space area, which is effectively a place which allows you to collect certain memories, notes, or for example audio notes when it comes to browsing on your smartphone. You can even use this via the built-in camera app, which can be handy in certain scenarios. For example, if you're shopping around and you're browsing and then you just want to have a little bit of a note or memory of what you've actually seen so that you can then share it with your partner or your friends or family, then you can do that. The essential space is effectively Nothing's means of integrating AI within their smartphone. Now, while I do appreciate its inclusion in certain instances, I don't find that the dedicated button here, which cannot be reprogrammed, is something that will be appreciated by certain consumers like myself. Especially given its placement is right next to the power button, it means that you'll be often accidentally pressing the essential space button rather than a power button. Hopefully this can be addressed in a future version of the phone, but what I've been able to see via an interview via the CEO is that they're really trying to double down on the essential space function, and therefore this is really here to stay and just something that you should be mindful about before purchasing a Nothing or indeed a CMF phone. This actually brings me on to talking about some of the other features, and here you've got 128 up to 256 gigabytes of internal storage, which I do think it will suffice for the vast majority of consumers. But if you do run out of space, for example if you've taken a lot of photos and videos over the years and left it on your smartphone, then here you can actually expand it to up to 2 terabytes. This is thanks to a micro SD card, which is somewhat of a novelty nowadays, so it's therefore very much appreciated to see it present on the Phone 2 Pro. This will of course take away one of the SIM slots, where here you've got a dual nano SIM capability. And here it is also worth pointing out that you've got no eSIM capabilities either. As for connectivity, you've got Bluetooth 5.3 with some of the major codecs supported, therefore giving you higher res audio playback, and you've also got Wi-Fi 6 support. Now while that's all very well and good, it is worth pointing out that you've not got a 3.5mm jack, which will come as a disappointment to certain individuals because it is present in some other rival phones. Equally, you've only got a singular downward-facing speaker, and yes, that means you've not got a stereo output like you'd find on the vast majority of alternatives, including some cheaper phones out there. It would have been great if the Phone 2 Pro integrated dual speakers and also, for example, the likes of Dolby Atmos, but alas, that's not the case. The singular speaker does, however, get pretty loud, but it has got a 150% boost mode. Now, I'm not really sure how the manufacturers worked out the percentage, because when it came to doing my objective test using a sound meter, I found a total volume of roughly 80 decibels in the normal output mode, while in the boost mode it went up to roughly 83 to 84 decibels. Nonetheless, the phone does get pretty loud, although it's worth mentioning that if you're going to go on the boost mode, the overall sound quality does really reduce. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the CMF Phone 2 Pro. And in all honesty, I've actually been left more impressed by this smartphone than some of the Nothing phones that have recently been produced. Because you have got a pretty impressive rear camera configuration, some nice quirky aesthetics, which sure enough doesn't have that same sort of modular design as the original Phone 1, but I suspect a lot of consumers probably won't care all that much. Then you've got a very fluid 120Hz AMOLED display that gets very bright and also quite dim. Then you've also got a decent chipset performance that will power you through your day, and a fantastically optimized software. Just to add the cherry on top, you've got phenomenal battery life, specifically given a phone of its price point. As a result of all of this, I can definitely see myself recommending it, and as such it gets my Best Buy award. The main considerations are the overall autofocus capabilities, recording, and also its overall price tag, where there's some other alternatives that will come in at an even cheaper price point and therefore might be ones that you might want to consider. Some of which I've reviewed will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of the Phone 2 Pro down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over some rival alternatives. Now if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.